Good early afternoon, everyone who is following us online or who is watching from in a bit later, and welcome to yet another EU-Pacific Talk, a series of debate organized by European Institute for European Policy. This time we're going to focus on the topic of trade relations with the Indo-Pacific region. In the past couple of years and during the past crises that we have seen, we saw the importance of this topic and also the importance of being diversified but not closed off in our trade relations. But I will, however, not speak much about that because we have much more expert and experienced guests to explain and talk about this topic. So I am very happy to be joined today with Cora Jungbluth, a senior expert with the Bertelsmann Stiftung. Welcome. Also, Professor Masahiro KAWAI from the Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Tokyo. Thank you for joining. And Dr. Jan Kovář, Deputy Research Director and Head of Center for European Politics at the Institute for International Relations. Thank you as well. My name is Kristína Chlebáková. I'm a project manager with EUROPEUM, and I'll be really happy to guide you along this debate today. Before we start with the opening statements of our guests, I would like to remind our audience watching and following us online that you can also pose your questions in the comment section below the video that you're watching. My colleagues will make sure that the questions get to us. And without further ado, please, for the opening statement, I would like to ask firstly Jan to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristína, for introducing and for having me. It's my pleasure. And my introduction, as we will speak about trade policies, will be less about in the Pacific region, but perhaps more about trade policies or external trade or commercial policy per se. And I have just a couple of remarks, so hopefully I'm not too long, but I started my stopwatch to keep me disciplined and then not go over the time allocated. And starting with like a general remark perhaps is that if you look at the recent developments in, let's say, past couple of years, 3 years or so, the developments have clearly created a new space or new environment, new background for trade policies, for free trade agreements, not only from the perspective of the EU, but also from the perspective of the prospective partners of the EU. But clearly, as I come from Czechia, I will more look at it from the perspective of the EU rather than the partners. And this new environment is to a large extent characterized by conflicting incentives for trade, external trade and free trade agreements. On the one hand, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, what they have clearly showed is that, the fragility of supply chains, they have clearly shown that there is a certain, price eventually to pay for extremely open market economies. When this kind of disruptions happen. In other words, economic interdependence and free trade, while from my perspective good per se, is not necessarily without costs at certain points in time. And this is the new, and you can clearly say that this has created a certain backlash against trade policies, a pressure for relocalization, less dependence on certain actors, especially Russia, but also China. In terms of trade, you can speak about pharmaceuticals now. We lack many of those in Czechia because of supply chains and so on and so on. So and it also created a certain or strengthened the anti-globalist, anti-growth movements, the nationalist and protectionist movements in member states, as well as their political representation to a certain extent in certain member states. So this is a certain, I would say, constraining factor for more free trade, agreements. On the other hand, the very same developments, COVID-19 and the Russian aggression against Ukraine created a new opportunity for more free trade, exactly because you cannot relocalize everything, all the production chains and everything to Europe. It's not cost-benefitly wise, and it's not even feasible to a large extent. So it also created a space for diversification of partners, of trading partners, away from Russia clearly, but also away from China, seeking new partners, especially when it comes to, access to raw materials. Perhaps you can mention, Chile or Australia in terms of lithium, because they are the one of the fuel or one of the largest world producers of this strategic resource. So while the recent developments have been constraining to a certain extent the status quo of existing interdependence, open economic, focus, it also creates space for more free trade agreements, exactly because of, the reasons of, to diversify supply chains, but also because of geostrategic or geopolitical reasons. And especially now focusing on, Indo-Pacific region, clearly that there is in line with the EU strategy, there is a hope or need to, or at least a declaration to diversify or counterbalance China and the dependence of the EU on China when it comes to, imports of many products, which clearly favors then countries such as India, Australia, or ASEAN, either as a group or individually, member states of ASEAN, for more free trade agreements and other types of association cooperation agreements. So, and this is, I'm talking for 5 minutes now, so I guess I'm going to close it here. So what I was trying to basically say that, there are some constraining factors as well as some enabling factors stemming out of the recent developments in the past couple of years.
Thank you, Jan, and we are really happy and glad that you provided this kind of introduction to the environment that we find ourselves in, because it's important to, when talking about trade, realize what are the current topics and current trends. Now I would like to give the floor to Masahiro for his opening remarks, and you can also share your slides whenever you need it for your talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation to this EU-Pacific discussion. I'm very happy to be here. I want to focus on the Indo-Pacific issue. The Indo-Pacific region is gaining a lot of economic gravity because of the growth of countries in the Indo-Pacific. I would include China also in the region, not just India, Japan, the US, Australia, and a few other countries. So this region is an enormous economic region. So this region provides a lot of economic opportunities to everybody. And at the same time, this provides a certain element of risk. Now, Japan has been working very hard to develop the notion of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And even under the Trump administration, the United States got interested in this idea, and the so-called Quad was formed. The United States, Japan, India, and Australia. Japan took its leadership in rescuing the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership after the Trump administration decided to leave the TPP. So now TPP 11 is in place. 11 countries are members of CPTPP, Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. But it was unfortunate that the United States left TPP. Also, Japan worked with China and other regional members, even including India initially, to form RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was expected to be a 16-country large FTA, including China, India, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and ASEAN, 10 ASEAN member countries. That was implemented, but unfortunately, India decided to pull out in the last minute. In the Indo-Pacific region, there are two mega FTAs, CPTPP and RCEP. The US is absent from these. India is also absent from these. That's unfortunate, but there are a few overlapping countries. I just want to show you this slide. I want to talk about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but the right-hand side table shows the membership of RCEP, CPTPP. Now, as I said, the US is not in there. India is not in there. So the challenge is how to bring the US and India into this picture, and how to encourage the European Union to expand its trade relationship with the Indo-Pacific regional economies. I argue that these are major challenges. Now, the United States, under the Biden administration, has taken initiative called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This is not a trade agreement because there is no market access arrangement in this framework. But it's interesting. It's a framework for trade and investment rules. So there's no market access, no tariff reduction, but it's all about rules on trade, also supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy. 14 countries have decided to join, of course, including the 4 Quad members, Korea, and even Fiji, Pacific Island countries, and 7 ASEAN member countries. And negotiations started December last year. So we want to see, we want to see how this negotiation would go, but it's a it covers wide-ranging issues on trade pillar, labor, environment, digital economy, agriculture, and so forth, supply chains, and clean economy and fair economy. I'm not going to explain all of these, but this is what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region. The Biden administration cannot go for free trade agreements involving market access because of the domestic political constraints. So this is the way that the United States has chosen to go, and Japan is supporting it. But from a wider, from a greater overall perspective, I want to point out the 5 challenges are there for the Indo-Pacific region. One is how the Indo-Pacific region can bring the United States back to a trade agreements, TPP. Okay, it may take time, but we need that. The second challenge is how we can convince India to join mega trade agreements and open their markets. And from that perspective, we want to see how the EU is going to negotiate with India and convince India to open its market to the EU countries. The third challenge is how to bring or encourage EU to strengthen trade connections. As we saw in a small table, EU does have some trade agreements with the Indo-Pacific countries, but not not a substantial part of member countries, say IPEF member countries. Okay, the fourth challenge is how to balance national security considerations against free and open trade and investment arrangements. We cannot exclude China from any trade arrangements or trade relations with China are important, still important. So from an economic security perspective, each country would have to make its own choice to make sure that the country is economically safe, and yet each country can prosper. Okay. The fifth challenge is to make this IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, a success. I think if this rule-making initiative is successful, that can provide some good guidance to the global rule-making, and we can induce China to come in. Why don't I just stop here as my initial talk? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also for this overview of what's happening in the region and a bit of realism that we need to remember, especially with the points towards China during this debate. And finally, but certainly not the least, Clara, please, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Kristína, and also thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be part of this important and timely discussion. My input is actually based on an infographic I did with my team on free trade agreements of the EU, China, and the United States in the Asia Pacific. And I will be happy to share the link afterwards, or the organizers may be able to do so. So I think my input fits nicely with my two previous speakers. In my opening statement, I would like to argue that the Asia Pacific could be the test case for a geopolitical EU trade strategy. If we look at the region, and Masahiro already mentioned that, Even without China, its countries represent like 30% of the world population, 20% of world GDP, purchasing power parity, and roughly 20% of world trade. So the Asia-Pacific is a key region for future global growth in terms of market size and purchasing power. And it's also key for global trade since major shipping routes run through its waters. So consequently, the three big economic players, China, the United States, and the European Union, are vying for power and influence in this important region. And given the growing systemic rivalry with China, it is really vital for the economic and political interests of the European Union to pivot more strongly toward the Asia-Pacific, especially when it comes to the much discussed diversification of trade away from China. Also, the EU has committed to pursue a more assertive trade policy, and this ambition could be put to test in the Asia-Pacific, especially vis-a-vis the other two big players, United States and China. Of course, and I really want to make this point here, from an economic point of view, the multilateral approach to global trade under the roof of the World Trade Organization would still be the first best option for the global trading system. However, the process has been stalling for years now with really uncertain outcome. And also the current geopolitical environment leaves very little room to expect remarkable progress anytime soon. So therefore, bilateral free trade agreements, FTAs, I think are the second best option for the EU now to foster deeper trade integration and also incentivize trade with the respective partner economies. According to our analysis, which includes 14 Asia-Pacific states, the EU already has 4 bilateral agreements in the region in place. It's actually 5 if we include New Zealand, which due to methodological reasons was not part of our analysis. All of these agreements are so-called deep agreements, meaning they go beyond mere tariff reduction and also cover issues such as investment standards or intellectual property rights. That actually means or promises a higher level of economic integration between the respective partners. 3 more bilateral trade agreements of the EU in the region are under negotiation. While we were doing this analysis, the EU actually took up negotiations with India again, which had been stalling for, I think, 8 or 9 years at this point. And this, of course, is a very promising thing, as India is an important partner in the region and also has very high growth prospects. Another 3 FTAs are still on hold. Today, the EU is also not involved in any of the 2 mega regional trade deals. Masahiro has already mentioned them, the RCEP and the CPTPP. And also there is no FTA in place between the EU and ASEAN, since negotiations on such a region-to-region agreement were stopped in 2007 and have not been taken up so far. If we now compare the EU's engagement in the region with that of the United States and China, we find that China takes a very proactive approach, while the United States rather refrains from further trade deals. Masahiro already mentioned the reasons for this. China altogether has 4 trade deals in the region. It has a trade deal with ASEAN. It is member of the RCEP. And in 2021, China also requested to join the CPTPP. Also, of course, being a hegemonic power, China is striving for securing its military reach into the region. In contrast, the United States is not very active in the region in terms of trade deals. It has the IPAF, and also mentioned by Masahiro, but it's not really a trade deal. It's rather a partnership with less binding economic commitments. And the US is also focused on military and security-related initiatives in the region. For the EU, trade agreements currently are the key tools to use to take a more active role in the region. And so to conclude, I think there are 4 ways for the EU to pivot more strongly towards the Asia-Pacific as one or maybe the important trade region in the future. First of all, the EU should look more carefully at compliance with and at the utilization of FTAs and regularly review whether FTAs need to be updated. In FTA negotiations, the EU should move more rapidly to a conclusion and subsequent enforcement. At this point, however, it is really vital to consider the respective partners' development level and local needs. Secondly, the EU should put a stronger focus on its region-to-region relations with ASEAN and really strive and put more effort into achieving EU-ASEAN FTA. Thirdly, the EU should start talks with the RCEP and especially the CPTPP about possible cooperation, ranging from observer status to associated or even someday full membership. Fourth and last, and I must warn you, this may sound like a utopia right now, given current geopolitical circumstances, but I would still like to mention this point to maybe end on a more optimistic note. So fourthly, the EU should strengthen the Asia and Europe meeting and advance it to an important cooperation platform with a long-term vision. And the focus really is on long-term here of establishing a free trade area between Asia and Europe and FTAAE. And I think I leave it at this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you for that. I will now follow up with a few questions. We have already talked during your opening speeches, or you have talked about the current environment and the incentives or motivations for the way that the trade policy and trade relations are constructed right now, let's say. Something that's often mentioned, but I would like to go a bit deeper is, and it's really current, at least with the Europe centered view that we have here during our discussions, is the Russian aggression in the Ukraine, but also something that we might have forgotten about, but that's the COVID-19 crisis and the big stress on supply chains. How exactly can these stresses, these kind of disruptors, be motivators to move towards better and deeper cooperation between EU and the region, either Asia or Indo-Pacific? And I'll open the floor to whoever wants to answer first. Okay. If I could firstly have a European point of view, Jan, can I ask you with the Czech perspective?
Well, I'll try to tackle the question. But I believe I kind of a little touched upon it in my previous intervention, and that's mostly by making pressure on divergence. Because clearly there is, and especially during the French presidency, it was even more evident. There's been for logical reason of domestic elections, there was even more pressure on protectionism. But already the Czech presidency, as one of the supporter of FTAs, and the Swedish as well, by the way. But the Czech presidency, if I'm not mistaken, have concluded the EU-Chile FTA. Somewhere in late December, signed the agreement. So it's not in force, obviously. So how exactly they can be drivers? Well, by making pressure on divergence in terms of trade relations of the EU away from certain actors to some other actors. So while there may have been pressure for relocalization, sometimes even, self-sufficiency. You can see the food security issue being raised because of the war in Ukraine. So these are exactly, issues going against free trade, especially food security and the chronic protectionism of the EU within the common agricultural policy. But if you put this aside, you cannot, as I said, you cannot really relocalize the production of pretty much everything. Plus, clearly, from the EU's perspective, when you look at some of the raw materials, well, you don't relocalize those because they're located somewhere, right? You just so even this kind of pressure on the divergence of supply chains leads to diversity in basically seeking new partners or making pressure on being more proactive on negotiating new free trade agreements, either on a bilateral basis or region-to-region basis, which I'm afraid, unfortunately, is not going to happen anytime soon with, for instance, ASEAN, as I see extreme political, economic, developmental divergence within ASEAN that kind of mitigates against the possibility to sign a region-to-region. So what we may see instead is, and we do have certain bilateral agreements already, either in place or signed, some others not being negotiated because of, I don't know, palm oil and deforestation issues. But rather than, region-to-region agreements, I see it more likely for the EU to, try to negotiate bilateral ones, even with ASEAN countries. Because of the, as I said, the existed divergence, political, economic, developmental, you can even say social divergence of these countries. And then perhaps the bilateral FTAs in the longer term will produce certain regulatory convergence among ASEAN countries, which would open a window of opportunity to sign eventually in the long term a region-to-region agreement between the EU and ASEAN. But I just believe that there are these two trends, and clearly both of them will play a certain role on relocalizing certain more protectionist features or self-sufficiency features, trying to stabilize supply chains or make them local in a sense that they are more resilient eventually. But at the same time, this movement away from Russia and China will create a pressure on more activism of the EU and its member states clearly, and the European Parliament in seeking and negotiating, and perhaps sometimes offering more flexibility or more attractiveness. Because I believe that the problem of the EU to a certain extent is that, especially with the, Commission last summer announced a new approach to FTAs, right? Greener, more sustainable, more environmental, and fairer, which basically means that there is even more externalization of EU environmental principles, labor rights, labor law, and so on, and even political, normative principles of European values, and their inclusion into the, trade and sustainability chapters of free trade agreements, which clearly is supported by certain actors in the European Parliament. If FTAs are not environmental enough, they not only are opposed by the traditional anti-globalists and agricultural interests, but they are also now opposed by those who are in favor of free trade deals in general, because they are not principled enough in the field of environment. So there may be a new group opposing FTAs, but not in principle, but because they are not far-reaching enough in terms of the trade and sustainable development chapters and environmental issues in particular. But this, if you put it all together, the more sustainable, fairer, greener environmental approach that the Commission wants to pursue, it may make the EU as a partner less attractive for third countries to sign FTAs, which eventually will make pressure, if the EU wants to go ahead, it will try to make free trade agreements more attractive in a different way, perhaps open their markets more, or perhaps if you speak or Mercosur, trade for cars for food, as it used to be called, perhaps open the market even more in terms of services, foodstuffs, agriculture products, and so on and so on. So there's again some issues that mitigate against each other in those higher requirements from the EU side in free trade agreements, meaning the EU does not have to be that attractive at the end of the day for partners around the world, including in the Pacific region.
Maybe I can
I
here
yes.
at this point, and I agree with much of what Jan has already said. Well, I think that the whole geopolitical environment has put a strong focus on the question of economic dependence and the question of cluster risks. So being very dependent in certain critical goods from one player, for example, China. I therefore think that not only in Western countries, but also in the Asia-Pacific region, there's awareness of the need to diversify away from China and to look more closely into geopolitical risk in supply chain. So I actually think we won't enter an age of deglobalization, but of a more focused globalization, which really prices in geopolitical risks, which was not the case before, because the phase of globalization, which is maybe coming to an end right now, was very much focused on cheap labor costs, cheap products, just in time production, and so on. And so we we'll see another phase of globalization, but I wouldn't call it deglobalization. Maybe it's something like regional globalization or global regionalization. We will see. I think that this is also the case why India was prepared to take up negotiations with the EU again. I mentioned these negotiations have been stalling for I think 8-9 years, so a very long time. But last year they came to the conclusion to take up negotiations again. And this is a good thing because it shows there's some movement in regard to free trade agreements. And free trade agreements are still a good tool to enhance at least bilateral trade. I mentioned that the multilateral process is stalling, and I don't see a chance that it will progress anytime soon. So we have bilateral agreements to take this place. So we might have some efficiency losses here. As for ASEAN, I agree with Jan that it's a really long-term vision to have a region-to-region agreement, and it's necessary to have bilateral FTAs with the individual ASEAN member states first, and maybe in the far future it will be possible to look at a region-to-region agreement again, which would make sense for both actually, because I would phrase it like this: China has been the factory of the world for a long time. It moves away from this role. It wants to, and it will, due to all these diversification going on. So the world needs a new factory, and ASEAN, or at least quite a few of the ASEAN member states, have the potential to become the new factory of the world. So this could be a long-term development we will see. When it comes to FTAs from the EU side, I think flexibility is a very important keyword here. The EU needs a very differentiated approach when it comes to negotiating FTAs with different partners. It really depends if the partner economy is a developing country or an industrialized country. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to this. And developing countries and transition countries like India need a different approach than maybe Japan or Australia, because these are the highly developed countries and maybe more on eye level when it comes to their development stage. Nevertheless, I think it's important to also look into environmental labor standards when it comes to FTAs. but you need more flexibility. You need longer transition periods for developing countries to someday meet these standards. And you also need more aid from side of the European Union to help these countries achieve these standards. You cannot just write these standards and the high quality standards in many areas into this agreement and expect the countries to get there on their own. So maybe it would make sense to more closely connect FTAs with development aid. And I'll leave it there for my first intervention. We'll come back to that later, maybe.
Masahiro, if you would like
yeah,
to, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I want to come back to Kristína's initial question on supply chains. Enterprises engaged in trade are facing enormous challenges in ensuring that supply chains are resilient, secure, and reliable. Now, I agree that the era of free trade based on just cost-benefit considerations may be over. Now, new elements would have to be taken into account. One is external shocks, the presence of external shocks like COVID-19, which disrupted supply chains enormously. So enterprises would have to make sure that their business continuity plans are put in place in a credible way, and facing future shocks, they have to make sure that their supply chains are broadly recoverable and functional. The second element is the excessive. It comes from excessive dependence on one country. Say China, in the case of China, which uses trade dependence as a weapon. It weaponizes trade dependence, and it can disrupt supply chains whenever the trading partner does something which is contrary to China's political interests, like rare earth, export prohibition to Japan, Australia's lobster, wine, coal export to China. China also uses such weapons against European countries also. So excessive dependence on one country involves risk. So diversification has to play a role, and also those global firms would like to be involved in so-called friend shoring, forming supply chains with firms located in friendly countries. So from that perspective, Indo-Pacific countries are very much interested in working with the EU companies. There are other considerations that affect supply chain formation, an increasing investors' interest in ESG, like human rights. So enterprises would have to, take into account so many factors, And also given the great power competition between the United States and China, whatever the US does from economic security measures and whatever China does from its own economic security measures, enterprises trading with both China and the United States would have to be enormously careful in not heavily violating their economic security measures. That's the reality. So this IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, has a pillar. It has 4 pillars, but one of the pillars is supply chains, and it includes several items like establishing criteria for critical sectors and goods, increasing resiliency and investment in critical sectors and goods, establishing an information sharing and crisis response mechanism, strengthening supply chain logistics. So Indo-Pacific Economic Framework tries to ensure that among friendly nations, they help each other in sustaining reliable and secure supply chains. And the bigger the number of countries, the better. So it has only 14 countries. Many more countries can join or take kind of cooperative arrangements with IPEF. And I strongly encourage the European Union countries and enterprises to work with this IPEF rule making, particularly on supply chains, but not limited to supply chains, trade issues, clean economy also. Jan mentioned this. Why don't I just stop here now?
Thank you. And I will also like to touch upon something that Jan mentioned in the previous intervention, and that's this kind of fattening up of the FTAs with measures for environment, labor rights, but also something that's not even part of FTAs, but that European Union's legislation often includes provisions that then in the aftermath kind of have influence on the trade relations. Cora, do you think, and you already touched upon the flexibility and aid aspect, but do you think that this kind of complication and inclusion of so many aspects helps with the flexibility of EU? And your 4 points from the beginning and 4 ways how the EU should be more active in the Asian region.
Okay, sorry, I had to turn my mic on again. I think that the modernization of free trade agreements to include issues that also go beyond, let's say, classic trade issues is an important step, and it's important to secure certain global standards also in regard to environmental, social, and labor issues. But as I mentioned in my first intervention, I think a really differentiated approach is necessary here, and a discussion with the respective partner, depending on the question, is it an industrialized country or a developing country, and to really sit down on eye level and discuss these issues, and also see, understand better what does the partner need to maybe get someday to the point to implement these standards and really help even after the FTA negotiations have been concluded and ratified and the implementation process starts, to maybe look more into this process and see how the European Union can support partners to get to this point, because many developing countries also want to improve their standards, especially when it comes to environmental issues. And this would be, I think, a very important aspect to look into when it comes to future EU trade policy.
Thank you. Something that someone that we've talked about and Masahiro mentioned during his opening speeches statement is China. And as Jan mentioned, we have to diversify, but we cannot stop trading with China because that's simply not even possible, but not rational. What are, however, some kind of principles that we should apply in terms of, or keeping in mind that China does tend to use the trade relations and the big dependency as a weapon? Let's see, first, maybe Masahiro, since he was the one talking about it first.
Yeah. Whenever China uses trade dependence as a weapon, we have to bring it to the WTO. We have to do that. China is very much interested in WTO. China values WTO very highly. It may be a surprise to you, to many people, but actually China values the WTO very highly, and that's a very important channel through which we can influence China's behavior. When China restricted the exports of rare earth to Japan, Japan brought the case to the WTO, and WTO delivered that China, delivered against China, and China had to change its policy. But now the WTO is not in good shape, particularly its dispute settlement mechanism. So I think it's very important for all countries to make sure that at least the dispute settlement mechanism would be restored, so that the two-step procedures can be recovered. Anyway, China may continue to use its weaponization of trade interdependence. So we have a tool to address. Just maybe, sorry, one more very brief comment is that even though we may not want to depend on China that much, still China's market is expanding, continues to expand, and trade is growing. So in the area which is not related to national security, I think there is still a enormous opportunity for many countries and firms to benefit from trade and investment with China. Thank you.
Maybe to give my few cents on China, I fully agree with what Masahiro said. China will remain an important trade partner for the European Union as well. But the thing is about dependencies, critical dependencies, not overall interdependence, but critical dependency. So certain goods that are, for example, critical for the green or digital transition. The European Union has to see that it's not excessively dependent on China for these technologies. This is a big thing to say, because it's all around the press that 80% of solar panels come from China. So if they stop exporting these, maybe we're done with the green transition. But still, the European Union is working on this, and this is really important. But there are larger parts of mutual trade which are not that sensitive after all, and which will continue. China won't go away. It's one of the economic superpowers of the 21st century. So we have to find ways of cooperating and trading with China, just maybe including more the geopolitical risks associated with this special relationship. The EU has already started to overhaul its toolbox in order to counter economic blackmailing by certain countries. We had the case of Lithuania, for example, and the EU has introduced the anti-coercion instrument in order to counter these initiatives, even though this instrument actually goes back to the Trump era. And we have to remember that the US under Trump also did this kind of economic coercion. So it's not all about China here. And I think it's important for the EU to have this kind of instruments, but ideally they will rather serve as deterrents and not so much for applying them. Of course, the EU should be willing to apply them, but in the best case, it doesn't come to that. So the EU has been doing some really good things in this regard, and the process is still continuing. So this is, well, the difference I see here in the EU external relations as compared to the past, that the EU really has had a strong focus on defensive trade policies in the last couple of years, but this was necessary due to the changes we see in the global landscape.
I also give floor to Jan to comment on this, but would like to ask further on this. Is the EU and especially the member states in their current kind of geopolitical situation able to realize these small patterns or important stuff to kind of pay attention to when dealing with China?
I will first. Actually, Masahiro and Cora are obviously more experts on China and related relations with China. So I would very much agree with what they said. I would only underline, what Cora mentioned. This critical dependence. It's really the key issue, and from our region, this can very easily be exemplified on the case of dependence on gas, Czech and Slovak dependence on the Russian gas, right? This is the typical critical dependency that many even back in the days said we should avoid, but we never really avoided. Now we know that it was not the right thing to do, and hopefully we'll take the lessons learned. But this is the same issue, with the critical dependency toward China. As Cora mentioned, for instance, solar panels, but digital transformation related issue, chips, and so on. The lack of investment in these, industries in Europe, in terms of startup and everything, led to a long-term lack of competitiveness of European companies in the digital field in general. Like, if you look around the world. And name digital companies, large ones, you will have difficulties to name a couple of European ones that really matter at the end of the day, compared to Japanese, Korean, Chinese, American, and so on. So that's perhaps another lesson learned in terms of the critical dependencies in the digital field. But if I just may very briefly on, Cora mentioned the flexibility issue before. I very much want to support that, but also perhaps want to raise a flag of warning, not in terms of flexibility in a sense of treating different countries differently because they have different economic development and state, but what has recently become a trend, and quite logically, because EU FTAs, they take ages. I mean, like, they are signed and then they take ages to be ratified. Sometimes they're not even ratified at the end of the day, because of the constitutional principles. You have EU level and you have the national or even regional level where you need ratification. So recently, what has happened is that. And I believe, Mexico is now being pressured along this way, but this has already happened with New Zealand and Australia, I believe, is that trade agreements, FTAs, are divided. They are no longer treated as mixed agreements, but they are divided between the trade aspects that can be, approved at the EU level only, so the Council and the European Parliament, and then you have the non-trade, the mixed aspects, right, including environment, including the trade and sustainability chapters, including investment, including services very often, because these are also shared competencies, and it's not still clear, even after the ruling of the Court of Justice in 2017, whether they should only fully be approved at the EU level or they also need ratification at the national level. And the problem here is that this may create a backlash, this dividing of FTAs, which makes sense because it gets the FTA, at least the trade part, into enforcement and implementation much more, in much shorter time. Rather than waiting for the national ratification of the mixed agreement. However, this may lead to a backlash, especially in the European Parliament and among the more environmental friendly countries against FTAs, because very often this may eventually in future lead to the fact that the non-trade issues will not be ratified and will not be implemented. And only the trade agreement, the trade part of the agreement will actually be in place, which clearly, if you have the new coalition of, actors being less in favor of free trade agreements, and this coalition is very much, stressing the environmental aspects or the lack of environmental principles in free trade agreements, in the longer term, this may lead to less free trade agreements actually be approved at the EU level because they will be divided between these two. So it's very difficult to navigate here. Either it takes ages to implement FTA because it's a mixed agreement and it needs ratification and approval at the EU as well as at the national level. But at the other side, at the same time, there is this risk that if you only focus on the trade aspect of the of FTAs, then there's going to be a backlash among certain members of the European Parliament and even member states, such as Sweden, that are normally pro-free trade. However, they are very keen on including trade and sustainability chapters. So that's I know that was not really short eventually, so apologies. And I completely forgot your question, Kristína, but I guess I can leave space for others as well now.
Yes, so if you would like to react to that, we can maybe get to China or maybe get to the other topic that I want to get, but I see Cora maybe.
Yeah, I really see your point, Jan, and that is one issue I've been wondering how to solve it, because on the one hand, it is important to also talk about these non-trade related issues with partners worldwide in trade negotiations. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, how will the European Union get these agreements through, especially when it comes to the non-trade related issues? I think we see here a kind of fragmentation inside the European Union, since, as you mentioned, different member states pursue different goals and are at different points when it comes to environmental issues. And I don't have a solution for that. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be standing here. And this issue of fragmentation brings me to China, actually. When it comes to China, we've seen, at least in the past and even now, the fragmentation in the approaches of member states. I mean, we had this 14+1 initiative, which was maybe a tool of China to put something in between the member states and prevent them speaking with one voice when it comes to China. But this is one of the most important issues of the European Union, I think. When it really wants to become a geopolitical player and put in the whole weight of its common market, which is an asset and highly attractive to countries worldwide, it needs to speak with one voice, not only when it comes to China, but also when it comes to FTAs. And the question, what should FTAs include, and where's the common, the commonalities of the member states? And I think this will be a lengthy discussion process to get there. I mean, on the one hand, we have the EU competency for negotiating FTAs, but due to the fact that FTAs now include non-trade related issues, it's the question if we should start discussing this kind of competencies. And the same is probably true when it comes to investment, especially foreign direct investment. We also have this fragmentation here. Speaking of the investment screening mechanism, for example, we have 18 different investment screening mechanisms in place. And for foreign companies that want to access the European common market, this is difficult because it's so fragmented. And I think this fragmentation is something, it's some kind of homework the EU has to do and has to do by itself. So when it comes to the whole discussion of trade, different diversification and economic dependencies, a lot is also about self-strengthening by the European Union.
Yes, Masahiro, I would like to react.
Right. Okay. Now, when you take a look at the TPP, it does include labor and environment, the so-called non-trade issues. But even China says it wants to be a member. China says it's going to go through reform. So perhaps putting excessive elements would be problematic, but I think there is an issue of balance. Maybe 20 years ago, as an economist, I think I was not happy in seeing labor and environment included in FTAs because they could be used as measures for protecting domestic industries. But today, I think the world is very different from 20 years ago. Investors, as I mentioned earlier, investors are increasingly interested in ESG and SDGs. That's the world. When you talk to Chinese investors, they talk about ESG, SDGs. Putting labor standards, environmental protection, climate change in a reasonable way would be something that I would support. Perhaps I'm sure the EU must be doing so, but depending on the country's readiness to fulfill the obligations, maybe the EU may request the country's commitment programs, on the labor issue, the environmental issue, and see how the progress is going to be made. And if necessary, the FTA may be suspended if there's no good progress observed. So that's how the EU can encourage countries to make their society more compatible with the global economic community. So I agree. I observe that the EU is taking a long time in finalizing negotiations. It's a wonder why it takes time to really finalize or to sign an agreement with Australia, New Zealand, and those countries. But I think the EU can be more aggressive in working with other developing countries in the Indo-Pacific region to expand FTAs. I'm not talking about increasing flexibility, but EU can demand, can make a reasonable demand, but in a realistic way. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you allow me, I would like to stay with you, Masahiro, a bit, because I want to move to another country, another partner or potential partner, let's say, and that's India. You have both Masahiro and Cora mentioned the reopening of the negotiations between EU and India. And Masahiro, you also talked that you would like to see and follow those negotiations really closely, also in the terms of building the Indo-Pacific economic framework. So what will you, or what should the countries in the region be looking at? What would be the priorities of the potential FTA between India and EU?
Right. As I said, the Indo-Pacific economic framework has 4 pillars. Trade, supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy. A fair economy includes anti-corruption and tax issues. Now, India is not joining the trade pillar. Countries can choose, which pillar it wants to join. India is the only country that has decided not to join the trade pillar, and it said that it has the digital economy part, and India wants to keep its own digital sovereignties, so to speak, rather than allowing free flows of data with trust. And also data localization is something they want to keep. Source code, disclosure requirement is something that India doesn't want to accept. India doesn't want to give up. So India is not joining trade pillar under the Indo-Pacific economic framework, and India did not join RCEP. RCEP is much more loose than CPTPP, and all ASEAN countries are members, even Indonesia. Indonesia is not happy in accepting the digital rule included in CPTPP. A similar rule is included in RCEP, but in a very, very loose way. So the point is that India is a difficult country. One reason why India decided to pull out from RCEP was the fear of importing too much of Chinese manufacturing products, and also the fear of importing too much dairy products from New Zealand and to some extent Australia. So it may be a challenge for the European Union. I think India wants to see more IT professionals to be able to work in the partner countries, and not many countries accepted that in the context of RCEP. So their economic interests did not go very well with other member countries of RCEP. So I want, I'm watching how the EU and India negotiate on their trade agreements. I have no suggestion for the EU. I just want to see how negotiations would go. But I want to encourage India to open up its market because it has huge potential. Its population is now bigger than China's population, and its economy is bound to continue to grow, and it's the ultimate counterbalancing power against China in terms of population and in terms of economic capacity. Looking at 20 years, 30 years from now. So we want to encourage India to grow faster. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Cora unmuted herself. Would you like to add something?
Yes, I would like to follow up on the EU-India FTA negotiations, because I think there are a few similarities between this FTA and IPEF. As Masahiro mentioned, the agricultural sector is a sensitive issue. I mean, the sector in India is still a huge employer. Last figure I remember is that about half of the employees is in agriculture. So it will be a very sensitive issue for India to open these markets. And also when it comes to data security, I think in the negotiations, it was an issue that India would have liked to be added on this data security list of the European Union, where up to now only a couple of countries have been included, not even the US. So this will be a huge issue to solve, actually. But still, the FTA represents huge potential for both sides. A couple of years ago, we actually calculated the economic effects of an FTA on the EU and India, and India could even benefit more in terms of GDP. However, specific sectors will be hit hard when India concludes this FTA, as I mentioned, agriculture. Also in the European Union, some sectors will experience negative effects, such as textiles, for example, and there will be some member states in the European Union which are maybe not too keen on concluding that FTA due to that reason. So I think it's fragmented again, and overall benefit, of course, but if you dive more deeply into the specific sectors, it remains difficult to find common ground, I think. It's positive that they restarted negotiations, and this also shows that India is interested in being a player in FTA negotiations, but that does not mean that they will conclude that deal anytime soon. I think it might even take another couple of years, and it's not said that there will be a deal in the end, but it's positive they're negotiating again.
Thank you. Jan, not to leave you out, if you want to react. Okay.
I guess, thank you, I'm fine, and because I would very much argue along Cora's lines, what she said at the end, that I don't really, even though there may be some pressure to reactivate those negotiations, or there has been pressure, I don't really see them, because of the divergence, of different industries and the interests on both sides. I see this is going to be a very difficult negotiations, even if the geostrategic or geopolitical environment has opened a way for it. Then the devil is in the detail, and there is a lot of details when it comes to EU-India negotiations that will have to be negotiated, and it's from what I see, it's going to be very, very difficult to find a common ground that is not extremely minimalistic at the end of the day.
Thank you. Our time is almost up. So as the last kind of round of interventions, I would like to ask you, about something more optimistic, maybe. We will see what you say. And that's your kind of expectations and maybe hopes for the next steps. The trade relations between the EU and the Indo-Pacific region is, of course, a really broad topic. So you can choose whatever you want to focus on. And let me start with Cora, please.
Thank you. Well, maybe only 2 points for my concluding remarks here. First of all, I hope that the EU will step up its efforts to negotiate and conclude more free trade agreements in the region, and also take into account the specific development levels of the partners, because I still think this is really key here. And secondly, I also hope the EU and countries in the Asia-Pacific will join their efforts to kind of save the multilateral process under the roof of the World Trade Organization, because especially for smaller and developing countries, it is really important to have a multilateral process where, like, not everybody is equal, but where they have tools to also counter stronger economies. And if it's bilaterally, they don't really have a chance to do so. So I hope that they will save the World Trade Organization, at least in the long run.
Thank you. Masahiro?
Okay, my final remark is that since the United States is constrained politically by not being able to be engaged in market opening, negotiating FTAs for domestic reasons, we need big players to promote freer trade and investment. And I think Japan has been playing that role in the Indo-Pacific region. The EU has also been playing its role. The UK, after departure from the EU, is trying to play its role. I think to complement the absence of the United States in this area, I think countries, large countries, EU, Japan, UK, and also Canada, Australia, they have to be more active in supporting the global trading system, and they can be more proactive in making FTAs or economic partnership agreements with developing countries, the so-called global South. I think we need to capture global South. Otherwise, the global South would belong to somebody else. So we are in the era where G7 countries or EU alone can work together and prosper. I think we need to work more broadly with developing countries in the global South. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, last but not least, Jan, please.
Thank you, Kristína. And I will perhaps try to argue along Masahiro and Cora. If you look at FTAs, since the EU took the bilateral approach to FTAs because of the failure of the multilateral mechanism, so at around, let's say, 2005-06, if you look at FTAs, they usually have been there usually have been phases of more protectionism and less protectionism, more focus on FTAs. So there's been a certain up and down trajectory. What I can see is that now there is a space for the upward trend and reinvented interest in FTAs in light of global developments, and sometimes even despite some of the constraining factors. So what I would, this is my concluding remark, is that what I would hope is that the EU will realize that there is an extreme importance in negotiating and signing FTAs, not just for the mere existence of the FTAs, but because they, at the end of the day, they also strengthen what Cora mentioned, multilateralism. It doesn't have to be via WTO, but this multilateral, a bilateral framework, the spaghetti bubble, where there you have interlinking, of individual partners vis-a-vis each other. They actually eventually strengthen multilateralism. So I would hope that the EU will and its member states will see that the FTAs are not important only because FTAs themselves, but they have certain wider importance, and that it will be able to make itself attractive for the partners, while at the same time retaining at the reasonable level the focus on non-trade principles. It wants to mainstream and promote, externalize, let's say, through FTAs. At the end of the day, FTAs strengthen, from European perspective, they strengthen European actorness. Because if you look at the European actorness in the global politics, it has been and still is most important via its external relations, and especially the commercial policy. In other words, trade. It's not foreign policy. It's not other issues. It's trade. So this actually strengthens EU actorness and leaves less space for others to take over, like Masahiro said, the global south. Then there's gonna be somebody else, active if the EU is not gonna make itself attractive enough and willing enough to conclude those, even though sometimes there will have to be some compromises made on some of the principles it wants to underpin its FTAs with. So I would basically say sometimes it's better to have something than nothing, and this should perhaps be even the suboptimal solutions at a certain point in time are better than no solutions at or measures or agreements at all. So I would hope that there is such a realization at the political level and also at the citizen level, which clearly then it's much more complicated at the end of the day to achieve. Yes, so thank you.
Thank you so much. I guess we could talk about this topic or these topics for a long time, and we certainly will continue to do so. But for now, thank you so much, all of you, for joining us, for your contributions. We feel like we have at least moved a bit along with the discussion, so thank you.
Thank you.
And to our audience, I'll just remind you that our series of debates will continue, and in the upcoming few weeks, you can expect a bit more technical debates on nuclear energy and automotive industry. For now, have a nice rest of the day wherever you are.